Great. Well, let's get started. So I want to start with a question. I know you just went through a couple of poll questions, but take a moment and think about what's the most frustrating data investment that you've ever made. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be, hundreds of thousands of dollars, but think about like the most frustrating data investment you've ever made. For me, this has definitely come in a number of different forms, but typically it's in this abstract idea of like, let's just invest in data. Let's get more data. If we have more data, we'll be able to find more things, which will be better for the business. What's really frustrating to me about that is it's very abstract. It's very hard to think about the why, right? This idea of investing in data, extremely popular 7 or 8 years ago, hasn't shown as much value as we need. And I want to focus a bit today on why. One place, if the previous question often leads people, is to the dashboard graveyard. If you work in a company of any size with any dashboarding tool, you can probably understand what I'm talking about, which is the number of dashboards that have been built for seemingly important purposes in the moment that no one has touched for months, years. No one's even sure if the data is good that underlies those dashboards. And this is a consequence of what I talked about before. We often invest in building things in the moment, but we don't invest in thinking about like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this for the long term? And both of these experiences are extremely frustrating. They also do something else. They kind of lead other people in the company to think about, why am I investing in this space if we're just building things that don't have holding value over time? And so when we think about why do so many data investments fail, we hear this all the time. If you talk to anybody, there's this seemingly well understood concept that a bunch of data investments fail. It's interesting to dig more into this. And that's what I'm hoping to do today, is to talk about what does it mean for data investments to fail. I think sometimes people assume that they're not technically sound enough. I disagree with that. Typically, the source of data investments failing is us not thinking about the long-term success and sustainability of those investments that we make. And what I want you to walk away with today is a way to think about that. What allows us to create more value? So when you think about like, what are you going to come away with from this conversation? I want you to think about things potentially in a bit different way, which is, rather than try to avoid failure, think about how are you going to build a data asset to actually create value. And this sounds fairly abstract right now. I get it. What I'm hoping to do in this conversation is to pin this down a bit more. And so I want to talk for a minute just about the title and the content. And when I focus on a few things and talking about data as a product, my focus here is very business oriented. Sustainable value is the key to this entire discussion, this entire talk. It's why I talk about data as a product in the first place. This idea, if we're going to invest in data, we're investing in an asset that we want to pay off, that we want to create impact over a longer horizon, right? We make large investments, not just to see them bubble up and do well for 6 months, but we do this in order to see things succeed in the long term. But what I am most concerned about is I don't think a lot of companies are prepared to think about what it takes to succeed in the long term. And so this idea of data as a product is very connected to that. Now that I've kind of introduced kind of why I want you to care, I think it's also important to say a little bit about why I care about this. Every conversation, every discussion point is biased in some way. And I think it's important that you understand where I'm coming from. So I lead our data product management group at Yelp. And this focuses very much on this idea of like, how do we create sustainable data products? Ultimately, how do we create good data investments over time? I love data science first and foremost. I've been fascinated in this space for the last 10 years. And really, like, where I've found the most enjoyment is definitely in this idea of being a data scientist, a teacher, and a writer. Something that I've done a lot is I care a lot about users and customers. I care a lot about this. And this isn't just saying I'm user-centric, but being customer-centric actually ultimately means figuring out what people care about, what creates value for them, why should they invest in this space. Something that's important to understand, I think, is I spend a lot of time thinking across disciplines. So even this idea of data product, this is thinking about data science, but also thinking about the practice of product management and thinking about what does it mean to actually cross these spaces. There's a whole lot of work that's been done in product management. There's a lot of things that have been developed in data science. As is true in most places, we're better off when we go beyond the boundaries of just thinking about our world. For some people on this call, it may be data science. For others, it may be product. For others, it may be neither. And the last thing I want to do is I like to start conversations, not end them. Very few people are true authorities on any topic in the data space. Most often what I'm trying to do is to give you a way to think about issues and problems that potentially you're facing at work, that potentially you could encounter, and perhaps look at them in a new way. And ultimately, like, today will be successful if you're able to do that, to take some of the things that I'm sharing with you, to think about like how you could apply them in your own space, in your own work. So what I want to do is, I'm not going to read through everything on this particular slide. What I want you to come away with is actionable steps. So as you hear me talk about themes and ideas and some of my own experiences, understand that I'm talking about my experiences and those have bias in them. What I'm trying to do in sharing those is to give you some potentially useful ways to think about new ideas and approaches to different situations. And to do that, I kind of have to give you a window into my world, right? I just can't talk in the abstract, data is this or data is that. I have to give you a very practical scenario that helps you think about, like, why should I care about this in this way? And so what I'm committing to you is to walk away with actionable steps to think about these things in different ways. What I'm going to ask from you is, as we're going through this talk, don't just think about my experiences that I'm telling you about. Try to think about how your own experiences intersect with this conversation, with this idea. Ultimately, that's going to give you the most value out of this conversation. So I want to start with something which is like, what is a data product? I get this question a lot. And my perspective here, which again, I'm not trying to necessarily be an authority on this topic, but how I think about it is, when data is the primary value proposition of a product for the user, I identify something as a data product. So there are many products in the world that use data. Some of our favorite products in the world leverage data, create algorithms in order to understand us and serve experiences. For me, when I think about data product, it's truly where data is the primary value proposition. So internally at companies, this could be your analytics platform, how you do product A/B testing, potentially how you serve ML models or do dashboarding. Externally, you potentially sell data, or you sell products that create insights for your end users. Ultimately, the most critical thing here is, when data creates the primary value proposition for the user, I identify something as a data product. And so today is all about trying to think about, how do we actually create sustainable value with this idea of a data product? Back to my question earlier, why is it so, what makes it so hard for companies to create sustainable value? My perspective here, it's not possible to just invest in data. Data needs to be super intentional. So when you hear about, back to my earlier point, we're going to acquire some data and we're going to do some things, and then if we have enough data, there's got to be something interesting in it. That doesn't fly any longer. we have to think about how we're going to actually transform data into an asset that does something for the business. So ultimately, when we're going through planning conversations, when we're saying, defining a vision forward, it doesn't suffice to say data will automatically provide the value. We, as leaders, as people who work with data, have to identify how that value is going to be created. It's not something that just takes care of itself. And that's gotten into us into a lot of issues up to this point. And so I mentioned before that what I want to give you is a way to think about these things. And so I'm going to use 5 themes and ideas. And this is what I tend to do in most of my writing, because I think it's much more actionable to come away with a list of things to think about. And so as I share some of these stories and experiences that I've had, what I hope is that they'll spur some of your own thinking and questions and perspectives. Ultimately, like for me, if you're taking the time to to attend this talk or watch it later, is that this gives you a window to think about your own problems and issues and data initiatives that you're facing at your own company. So for each of these themes, I'm going to try to give you 3 things. One is sort of a triumph, something that went well and related to this theme. I'm going to try to give you a perspective about a challenge I've experienced related to it, ultimately resulting in a lesson that I've walked away with. Each of these themes should give you kind of a perspective and potentially a way to think about why treating data like a product can be really useful for an organization. The first theme is that, generally speaking, organizations aren't sure what to expect from data. This might not be surprising, but even though when I talk to data scientists, they tend to agree with this. Yeah, organizations don't know what to expect from data. We don't do anything about it. We tend to just accept that as a given. But what's really critical is that we create a vision for organizations to understand what to expect from data, essentially create this perspective of what is the value that they're going to get. In some cases, you're going to have this handed to you. In the Triumph section, I worked with a retailer and they knew exactly what they wanted from data. They knew what behavior they wanted to create. They knew how they wanted to use it in pricing, and they knew what success would look like. Ultimately, this is a very big rarity. They knew what data product they wanted, they knew what it would do, and they knew the value proposition. More realistically, in almost every other enterprise I've been a part of, data has been viewed as this idea, this like thing that gets you value as if it's magic by existing. Like the term do AI or data science or analytics on it, honestly, like keeps me up at night, because we spend tons of money on data investments. And this idea that if we just wait long enough, it will produce value is ultimately not going to be helpful. So what do I want you to take away from this? Just like whenever you're thinking about a data investment and trying to treat data like a product, products need a vision, right? Products need a vision and a path forward. Very often, I see people focused very narrowly on the day-to-day operations of the business. You may be familiar with this. You may think, okay, I'm going to work on this dashboard today because marketing and demand generation decided that we should work on it. Okay, you have a very narrowly defined idea of why you're working on something. You may have an idea of where you want to get to, but there's not this path from like here to there. And so when you think about defining a vision for a data product, you need 2 things. One is you need to decide where you're going, right? Where are you headed with this product? What is it going to do for your company? If I invest in this tool or this platform or try to sell this external product, what is it going to unlock value-wise? And you also need a realistic here. You need an idea of like, where are we at this moment in time? Ultimately, the most important part of treating data like a product is that you actually have a realistic view of where you are now and where you're trying to go. And this sounds simple, right? But no matter how many times I say it, no matter how many times people might nod their head, the challenge is that it's actually not that easy to do. And so when you think about how to create value from a data product, I want you to really walk away with this idea. You have to create expectations. And creating expectations often requires defining this vision around what this product will do for your company. The second theme that I want you to focus on is the value of data often depends on who you talk to. And part of the challenge is that data products don't affect everyone equally. So why am I talking about this? Part of the challenge is that when I see investments in data happen at companies, they're often based off of anecdotal conversations. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you've just been in this high-level meeting and there was a business leader who was essentially, speaking up and saying, if I don't have this dashboard by next week, then the business can't run. Familiar? Maybe, maybe not. But this idea that our idea of what valuable data looks like is often affected by our experiences in the moment. And so in some cases, you might have great experiences. At Yelp, we have a set of, high-level operating priorities that are set. And we work with those, we follow those, we know what we're going to be working on. There's very little ad hoc decisions on like, okay, we're going to switch or change our vision or view of what matters. And so that ultimately is a good thing, right? You have this idea. And so there's not one person who's like overly affecting our roadmap. The value proposition is pretty well agreed upon at the top. But most realistically, high value at organizations is not universal across a company. Priorities change depending on, are you talking to business operations, marketing, sales? Are you talking to the data science team themselves? We try to create this idea of that we're going to have some universal set of priorities, but in most companies, this is not something that's realistic at the moment. It's also not a real description of what's happening. And so when we talk about the value of data, right, back to this overall idea that we're talking about, which is creating sustainable value, the most important thing that I think you can ask is sustainable value for whom, right? Who is going to benefit from this? Who is going to derive the most value from this investment? Ultimately, the company as a whole will probably not all feel the benefit of the investment in the same way. But that's okay. What you have to do is upfront, you have to say who's going to benefit from this product, right? Who's going to benefit from us investing in data in this particular way? This idea of sustainable value is not that you have to make everyone happy equally, but you have to know whom you're trying to make happy and what exactly you're going to do about that. So up to this point, I've talked about two themes. The first one, just as a reminder, being organizations aren't always sure what to expect. They kind of need a vision, right? They need you to kind of lead about where we're trying to go. That vision should not treat everyone equally, right? This idea that not every business partner, not every person in the company is going to benefit in the same way from the same investments. The third theme is to think about data consumers and producers. So if you've heard this term, great. If you haven't, I'll talk a little bit about it. We often, when we're talking about value from data investments, we often talk about the data consumers, right? Who's going to use the data? Who's going to see the dashboard? Who's going to actually make the money in the company? We often talk, it's very consumer centric, right? This idea that like our data consumers are actually going to use it, so we should only be talking about them. But this often leaves out one of the most critical parts, which is the data producers and their experience. So I work on an internal product team, and we focus a lot on not just what's happening for our consumers downstream, but also how do we actually create a good experience in producing the data? So potentially capturing events, storing them in the right way, making them available in our different databases. And I see we have, so I know that we have a question. So in terms of like tackling or overcoming this, I think when it comes to this idea, and I think this is a great question even for right now, which is data consumers and producers have different value propositions. Ultimately, the most important thing that we can do is to ensure that we actually have an agreed upon set of investments. Why are we choosing to invest in this particular area in this particular time? The most critical thing is not necessarily that you choose the right one, but that you make the investments more public. Ultimately, as a data team, when you are going to invest in particular spaces, think about why you're going to invest in an area and then share this out at the end. With the data consumer and producer discussion, we often have investments that are made in both areas. One is we want to make sure that the users have a better experience, right? So when they consume dashboards and data and they use metrics and create metrics, that it's useful for them. But we also want to make sure that our engineers and our data scientists and the people that are actually producing and capturing and storing the data have a good experience, right? This idea of like successful data products are a partnership between product, data science, and engineering. Really, you have to work together to understand what success looks like. One of the major challenges that we have is like a data science effort alone can result in a focus of like, I'm going to build this thing for this consumer, right? I'm going to build this for this marketing person. But they don't think necessarily about how to create a better experience around capturing, storing, and making that data available. So really effective data products cater to both the producer and the consumer of the data. Again, back to this idea of like sustainable value. If you build something and you only take into account the person who's going to consume it and use it, and not the people who are going to actually produce the data and store it and make it available, the likelihood that you're going to have something that's sustainable over time is much lower, right? The failure often doesn't happen on the like person side, on the person who's actually looking at a dashboard. The failure often happens in like corruption of data or dashboards not being updated. And so thinking about who's going to actually produce the data products is really, really critical. But I want to be real about something, which is no matter how many times I say it, building for long-term and building for sustainable value sounds good in a vacuum. But you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, I can talk about long-term value. But guess what? When something breaks, people are going to email me about the thing that's broken. They're not going to email me and say, okay, I know you're working on long-term value stuff. We don't really need to fix this. So one of the challenges here, and what I mentioned at the top, was that if you're going to create this idea of vision and sustainable value and really define who's going to benefit, you have to do this in an intentional way that recognizes the reality that you're going to have to work on now problems, not just future, right? So in a great case, at my last consulting engagement, the company and I really viewed the data efforts as a portfolio and it consisted of risk, return, and short and long-term investments. So what happened here is we identified this distribution, which is, okay, we're going to commit this percentage of time to our immediate area. And many of you may have this structure at your own work. This idea that we're going to have a percentage of time allocated to kind of responding to things in the moment, right? But also really protecting that time to think long-term. One of the major challenges that I see companies encounter is that they may say they want to think long-term, but they only put their investment, their time, and their energy behind the short term. And ultimately, like that's going to lead to, if not failure, you're not going to create as much upside from the data products that you build. And so realistically, the concept of like short and long term sounds nice, but if you want to get and actually create a sustainable set of data products, you have to get people to buy in, to actually invest and think about this space. And you have to get people to commit, not just to nod, not just to like not say anything in a meeting, but to actually commit to a portfolio of investments. Because ultimately, if you get, let's say that you have a number of awesome projects that you kick off today, 6 months from now, let's say that there are changing priorities and there's a major fire issue with data. Who's going to stand up and say, okay, we still need to work on and think about the things for the longer term? If you don't have people that have originally committed to that type of investment and that type of conversation, it's very, very challenging to have someone support and keep that focus in the long term. Ultimately, I think this is why so many data investments don't create sustainable value, is they don't have someone who's accountable and responsible for ensuring that it's created. And so this is really where we talk about incentives. How do you create incentives? How do you create incentives that focus on the long term? This is very much done through people. And again, to my point earlier, what I'm trying to do is to give you things to think about. I don't have the answer for every organization or every team dynamic, but what I can tell you is that you have to get commitment and you have to have a sponsor if you want things to persist and live long term. This is true for data products. This is true for almost any investment that we have at a company. The fifth theme is that data product owners are critical. And whether you call them data product managers, data product owners, so data product experts or subject matter experts, I don't necessarily care. At Yelp, we've created a specific group of product managers to focus in this space. For example, focusing on our analytics products that we manage internally. But at most companies, you may not be able to build this entire organization, right? And so it's really thinking carefully about how do you actually identify an owner for a product? That owner becomes the sponsor. That owner becomes the person. So successful, I'll get to your question in just a second, Kurt. When it comes to thinking about data product ownership, it's really trying to ensure that we actually create a great experience. If you don't have someone committed to thinking about the data product and the ownership of it, I can guarantee you that no one is actually going to own it, right? This idea that we're going to create, like if we work hard enough or we spend enough money, we're going to benefit, we're going to get value from it. It's just not true. And so what you're starting to see with data product ownership, what you're starting to see with data product leadership is that people are investing in this area because they want to see persistent investment over time. And this is something that's really, really critical. So these are the themes that I have for you. What I want, ultimately what I want you to walk away with here is to shift away from this idea of thinking about why do so many data investments fail, instead to ask a question about how do we create an environment for successful data products. And these themes that I've talked about, I think are really critical toward potentially thinking about and unlocking that investment. Let's see. Sure, I will. Kurt asked, can you give, and so I'm going to switch over to Q&A. I'll put it on the last slide. Kurt asked, can you give some examples of successful incentives for the long term? So I think these have to be aligned at multiple levels. One of them is that you have to think about what is the incentive for the individual to focus on the long term, right? And typically individual reward looks like potential promotions. It looks like actual salary and compensation. And so ultimately you have to create incentives that tie people to, if they're doing quality work that focuses on the long term, they should benefit from it as much as they do for focusing on and solving short-term problems. Realistically, for individuals, we often have a set of incentives that are created to basically reward people for fighting fires. We don't reward people for thinking ahead of time to actually avoid those fires in the first place. So that's at the individual level. At the company level, this is really where it comes to like incentives are around like for leadership. Ultimately, leadership are accountable for setting the roadmap, the outcomes. And a really critical thing in this case is to actually make sure that leadership are aligned. If leaders are not aligned around something, it becomes glaringly obvious. And so at many companies, ultimately what I've seen be successful is this starts at the top. A president, a CEO essentially creates this, when we actually talk about long-term incentive plans, which is we have to have some focus on where we're going to be 3 to 5 years from now, not just how we're going to survive the next 6 months. And I get that changes depending on the business model and the approach that you have. But ultimately, like the set of incentives that you need to think about are both at the leadership and the company level.
Eric, there's another question from Sonia.
Sure.
What would you say are fundamental differences between data scientists, data analysts, and data engineers? Would you say there's a difference in how they're perceived in companies?
So I think with like this often depends on the company, I think. This idea of data scientists, data analysts, data engineers, I think data analysts are typically more viewed as telling you the what from the data, right? Which is, okay, we have data, tell us about the current state, tell us about things that are happening, like what happened with this trend at this point in time. The second thing is when it comes to like data engineers, they really tend to be viewed as people who enable the consumption of data in a more effective way, right? This idea that we have to think about how to capture data, how to move it, how to store it. And ultimately, like data engineers are responsible for and viewed as kind of the owners of that piece of quality. Data scientists, and this is not true everywhere, but I'm giving you kind of a generalized idea. Data scientists tend to be viewed as potentially a group who focuses on extracting value from data, which tends to be more tied to the why than the what. I see a lot of data scientist groups that are focused on looking at like causal inference. They're doing experimentation. They're trying to answer these why questions that dig a bit deeper than kind of the what or just the movement of metrics. So hopefully that's useful for that question.
I think
to others. So
I think it is Eric. Two other questions. First one of Ronnie. He remarks that the 5 themes that you proposed are critical for any product, not only data products. Can you go a bit deeper on what's specific for data products, or how does this approach differ from other product management?
So first of all, I'm going to back up for a second, which is to say that like, I continue to believe that product management is still a very murky and not super well-defined area. So part of what I'm trying to identify here is what does effective product management look like for products whose primary value comes from the data. Most of what I'm saying, I agree with you, is not necessarily taking entirely new framework and like creating an entirely new framework. What I mentioned at the start of the talk is I'm trying to think across disciplines, which is how do we actually take the frameworks that have been well developed potentially in product management and apply them to the data problems that we have. And ultimately, like, I think even if we took the most basic of product management frameworks and applied them to data, we would be able to create a lot more sustainable value in this space. And so this is not necessarily trying to reinvent the wheel with the idea of data product. It's trying to think about how do we carefully construct and use the knowledge and frameworks that we've built elsewhere and apply them to the data problems that we have.
Okay. And then a nifty question from Alex, and that's also something I see often in companies, and that goes about the responsibility of data product managers, and they are responsible for the product. But what with data ownership? Is it the same responsibility of the data product managers, or do they work together with data responsibles, or how do you see that working?
So I'll give you two views. One is like what I usually see, and then versus what I would actually like to see. What I usually see is lack of clear ownership, right? There's very often a like, someone asks a question, who do I go to for this? And they're like, a total set of chaos and confusion ensues from that question. I've seen changes happen over time where product managers do assume kind of ownership over data sets and data assets. Ultimately, I think where I would like to see things go is a product manager really has to partner almost with an analyst or subject matter expert. Most of the data products that we work with, if you think about data sets and things like that, they have a lot of nuance associated with them, right? How they're collected, how they're stored, what different metrics mean. It may be challenging for a product manager alone to have visibility into like that, to troubleshoot things. So I think in some cases, a product manager can also be a subject matter expert. They can play both roles. But as a product starts to become, like a data asset starts to become really large and potentially hard to manage, having that subject matter expert, which is often probably would be some type of analyst, typically, at least what I've seen, is a really powerful way to ensure that there's a good partnership and sort of ownership around the data set and inside the company.
Okay, I also agree with the first part of your answer. Often there is no clear ownership. It's always subject of discussion.
It is.
A question of Steven, and he asks to give a few examples of very successful data products.
Sure.
According to your experience, and what makes them so successful?
Sure. So I'll start with one of the most critical ones that I am responsible for at Yelp, which is our A/B testing platform. So again, this data product, the primary value comes in that we enable product managers to potentially decide on what to ship and what not to ship. We have built this at scale, really from the ground up at Yelp, that enables us to run hundreds to thousands of experiments at a time to really understand and make the best decisions for our users. So this is a really complex system. It involves like leveraging metrics. We have a front end that enables people to set up and run experiments. We have a back end that ensures that we actually divert traffic to the right experiments. To me, like any experimentation platform, whether it's ours or whether you're talking about commercially available options from like Launch Darkly or potentially Amplitude, those are examples of like really critical data products because they're so connected to decisions. A second data product that I think about that's potentially more internal is this idea of a golden data set. Most people care about data. They have a less definitive idea of what it means to create a reliable and trustworthy data set. And so this idea of a golden data set is something that I think the first time I heard it mentioned was really like at Spotify, but it's happened in a lot of other companies now, which is you invest tons of effort in making sure that a particular data set is both trustable, reliable, and easy to search and find. And I think a data set can be a product because it ends up serving as an asset for the company to derive metrics from, things they can rely on. An external example would be potentially like, a tool that enables people to actually like understand, like, so let's think about a real estate example. I'm not sure how many of you like used or familiar with Zillow, but Zillow has, a valuation tool for estimating value of a property. What this does is it actually affects consumer behavior, right? People are actually able to understand potential valuation of a real estate property in a way that they might not otherwise be able to. And what makes it successful is it like meets the needs of the user. It helps people actually make sense of a really complex idea, which is like, how do I put a value on a property? And how do I get a reliable indicator of what that value is based on the market? So I think those three examples are at least illustrations of what good, solid data products might look like.
Okay, thank you. I have also a question myself. and that's about 2 themes that you proposed. The first one goes about data producers and consumers. You have to take both into account. I totally agree with that, because if you consume data which is crappy produced, then it's also difficult to get value from it. But then you have the theme short term and long term. The reason why something is crappy in a system is because probably it's done as a short-term solution. And then the data product itself is a product that was a bit forgotten. And there you get, there you have to deal with it. Do you also recognize that kind of balance, which is hardly found between both? And how would you solve this?
Yeah. So first of all, I recognize it. I agree with it. I think most people would say, like, most of the things where we essentially put a short-term solution, which is, hey, we found a problem with this data set, and they put the quick fix onto it rather than actually solving the underlying issue, that shows up in so many different places, right? Which is to like fix the pain point, not the actual like thing that was causing the pain in the first place. And, you know, this goes back to this idea of like, if you have an organization that has incentives built to entirely focus on the short term and to solve that short-term pain, you're going to get short-term solutions no matter what. And this idea, like when I talk about incentives, I know it's easy to gravitate toward like promotion, compensation, but there's also some set of like, you have to set expectations for what successful data scientists, successful data engineers, successful product managers look like. Very often when I look at a company's like leveling documents that give a job description for like what a person does, if you put things into their job description that say like, you're going to fight fires and move fast and pivot with the company, then you're going to get people who respond to short-term things. And so there's also like an expectation setting, an idea of defining what a role is at a company. Back to the great question earlier around what's a data scientist, what's a data engineer, what's a data analyst. You have to attach some sense of like where they should be focusing their time. Otherwise, to your point, you're just going to end up getting a lot of short-term solutions.
Okay, thank you. Also happy that you recognize it. Then
yes, recognize it really, really well.
Okay, that's also good to hear that the same problem is out there. Okay, I think we went through all the questions.
Cool.
I would like to thank you for this very nice introduction to data as a product. And like you already said, it's what you experienced. I hope that the attendees can make their own story from it and start working on their own products. I also see in the background that the sun is coming up, so
yes.
your day can start.
Yes.
Have a nice day, and thank you again for your introduction.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.